Well, welcome to our first Sustainability Meetup of the year. We appreciate you guys coming out here. My name is Melissa Halstead. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator with the Office of Sustainability at the University of Houston. At our office, our goal is to improve campus life and the natural environment, as well as a hub for all of U of H sustainability efforts. We host these sustainability meetups throughout the year in the fall and the spring semester, and we showcase different sustainability themes. We're trying to build a culture of sustainability on campus. Tonight, our theme is sustainable transportation, and I have the pleasure to introduce our spotlight speaker, Christof Spieler. So Christof has been a Metro board member since 2010 and was appointed by Mayor Parker and Mayor Turner. He's actually the first person appointed to Metro board as a result of writing a blog. He is Vice President and Director of Planning at Morse Architects. He lectures at Rice University, and he uses Metro for most of his daily trips. So I'd like you guys to, again, give a warm welcome to Christof.
Well, I'm really happy to be here to talk about transit in Houston. And I think transit is actually integral to sustainability. We often think of sustainability as something that's about gadgets. We take a building and we attach some solar panels to the roof. Or, maybe we take a parking lot and we add, a little drainage swale in the middle. I mean, that would be a lot more sustainable if that parking lot didn't exist. Or we take a building and we put a plaque on the outside and say that's only a building. But if we look at how we actually use energy in this world, if you think about your own personal energy footprint, and if we think about what actually takes up space on this planet, we can't ignore transportation. You have a beautiful LEED building that's kind of way out there and everybody's got to drive 30 miles to get there and they all park in a giant parking lot. That is not sustainable. And so I would say one of the most sustainable things we can do is put more people in a single vehicle. You want to make a city more sustainable, you do good transit, you do good carpooling, you do good walking and biking. And ultimately, if you think about it from the Metro standpoint, what makes Metro more sustainable? We can do natural gas buses, we're doing that right now. But the best thing we can do is put more people on those buses. As they're still going to burn as much fuel if they have twice as many people on it, and that means each of those people is using half as much. So we want sustainability, transportation's a big piece of getting there. But we also realize that that very much goes with what kind of city we build. Now this is my life and it's just about perfect. I live right there, I work right there, and I have that to get me from one place to the other. I have a 10-block commute, which is an amazing thing in Houston, and I have a light rail train running every 6 minutes all day to get me there. It's absolutely wonderful. And one of my goals in life is to give more people the opportunity to live a life like that. But before I started working at Morris, I actually worked out in Greenway Plaza, and my daily commute was the number 9 bus. And it was a very typical Metro bus route. It ran, every half an hour during rush hour, less frequently during the middle of the day, and it was, sometimes on time, afternoon often not. I would sometimes find myself standing out there for half an hour at the bus stop waiting for this thing to come. I really loved riding the bus. It made my life a lot better. But I discovered our bus network really didn't do a lot of things well. Like, if I was heading home and I wanted to go home to downtown, it was great, but if I wanted to head to Rice or to the museum, it was actually a lot harder than it ought to be. So I started wondering, what can we do to fix this? And as I got on the Metro board, something else started rising up on everyone's radar screen. And that's that we were losing bus ridership in a major way. Now, here's the graph. Right here's light rail. Light rail is doing great. We've got one of the most successful light rail lines in the country. Parking lines were fine, but local bus, look at that. That's not good. Losing ridership steadily year over year for over a decade, and you might look at that and think, oh, that means they cut service. But no, that blue line is how much service we were providing. So we were running more service and carrying fewer people. Clearly something was broken. And so we started asking ourselves, why aren't more people riding the bus? What was wrong with our network that didn't work? And it's not that it's a bus, because we know that in Houston, people are absolutely going to ride the bus if we give them good service. This is our park and ride network, all rubber tire, all bus. Of the people who work downtown and live in those outer suburbs, half of them choose to commute by bus. And these are generally people who can afford a car. They could drive the whole way. They take the bus because it's better. So there's nothing inherently wrong with buses. Here you can see those kind of commute shares. But our network was broken in a lot of ways. Now, one of those was frequency, which is, if you drive, frequency doesn't matter, but for all of you who ride transit, you know how much frequency matters. And here we had bus routes just washing out in a really busy corridor. At peak, we had a bus every 15 minutes, maybe every half an hour. Suddenly in the middle of the day, only a bus an hour. Now that means you might have the choice of being 45 minutes early or 15 minutes late. You start to have to plan your life around the bus, and that's bad. We want frequency where you don't have to look at a schedule. You just can show up to a stop and know you'll be there. This was our old network. Those red lines were those routes that ran 15 minutes or better all day. And notice how few of those there were. Like only one in the U of H area right here. And the blue routes every half hour, green routes every hour. You can see how much of the network was those infrequent bus routes. And those routes were also tremendously confusing. Here's Shepherd under our old bus network. That's like 5 different bus routes on the same street. If you want to ride the length of the street, sorry, you can't actually do that because there's a little gap up here. Like, this is a network that you simply would not be able to understand unless you took the same exact bus every day. One of my favorite examples, Route 40, 2 branches on the north end, runs through downtown, past downtown a couple trips a day, ran express. So if you accidentally got on the wrong number 40 bus, it might speed by your neighborhood on the freeway without stopping, in which case you'd be having a really bad day. And then at the south end, 3 different loops, all one way, running in different directions on the same street. I was never actually able to figure out the bus schedule well enough to know which bus took which loop. If you're a first-time rider, how are you going to figure this out? If you're somebody who doesn't commute to the same place every day, which is true, I talk to home health workers, for example, who go to different places every day, how are you going to figure that out? Also indirect. For some reason, our network didn't realize that things actually cross Main Street. So if, for example, you wanted to go over to the Greenway Plaza area over to this part of town, this is something you could drive in 15 minutes. You have to take one bus to Wheeler, then transfer to another bus, then transfer like by the side of the bayou next to the freeway over here. And 53 minutes and 2 transfers later, you end up in a place that is literally on the same street you started out. And that doesn't make sense. You had things like this where these routes just didn't quite, what if I want to go from there to there? There. And we also had a network that didn't work weekends. Now, we don't live in a 9-to-5 world. I mean, you guys don't live in a 9-to-5 world. I know there's plenty of evenings where you have to work longer than that. I know there's plenty of weekends where you have to come to campus. And if you think of what kind of jobs people have, I mean, first of all, if you're going to be dependent on transit, if you don't have a car at home, you need transit to get you to the grocery store on Sunday morning. You need transit to get you to church. You need it to do all those other things. And besides, when you get to the grocery store, somebody better be there to check you out and let you pay for your groceries. And how did they get to work? We had a network. This was our weekday network right here. That was Saturday. Notice how we went from all those frequent routes to only 3 frequent routes left. And notice there's entire neighborhoods. Look at these parts of town where the routes just disappeared. They were 5-day-a-week routes. And here's Sunday. Like just whole parts of town off the map and only 1 frequent route left. This was a network that did not work for you if you were trying to travel on the weekend. And it also didn't actually go where people needed to go. So if you look at population density in Houston, some of the densest places in Houston weren't actually served by those frequent bus routes. The network went where people lived in the 1960s, not where they live today. And if you look at employment centers, we all know Houston doesn't have one downtown, it has a whole bunch of them. And guess what? The network was only designed to serve one of them. So you had downtown where over a third of the people using transit, medical center also good. You get to Greenway Plaza, 5% of the people using transit, as the network wasn't designed to get them there. So you look at this and say, why in the world would Metro be running such a bad bus network? You know, there must be some real idiots doing that planning. But you look at it and you can understand why it happens. And here's my favorite example. This is the number 11 Nance bus. This was a bus in the old network, and notice that name, it's called Nance. Why is it called Nance? This is the Nance streetcar from the 1920s. Yellow is Nance Street and black is the streetcar route. Isn't Nance an appropriate name for that? It runs the entire length of Nance Street and then goes downtown. Of course it's the Nance streetcar. This was the Nance bus. It got extended outwards, it got diverted, and somewhere along the way, TxDOT built the East Tex Freeway and cut Nance in half, and the Nance bus no longer ran on Nance Street. But it was still called the Nance bus because it descended from the Nance streetcar. What you had here was a network where every step of the way, the instruction to the network planners was, we need you to serve this destination, we need you to deal with this complaint, we need you to do this, and we want you to change as little as possible. And every step that led to this route made sense. The sum total of them didn't make sense at all. And we had a network that was a historical artifact, that was based on what Houston used to be 100 years ago, not what Houston was today. But we also had a great opportunity, a bunch of new rail lines. And if you look at those rail lines, they connected to buses all over the place. So they really gave us a chance to rethink how our bus network worked. And so we said, what would that network look like if we reimagine it from a clean sheet of paper? Forget what the network is today. Let's just take data. We know where people live, we know where people work, we know where they board the system. Let's take that data. Let's gather all sorts of stakeholders who understand what the system is for and who's using it and why. And let's think about what we can do. And also, we can't really afford to spend more money. So this is about using the money we already have and spending it better. We did a whole lot of outreach, a whole lot of neighborhood work, and then after the board talked through what our goals really were, we put a bunch of smart people in a room and they started drawing maps. And here's what they were able to come up with. Number one, frequency. I talked about how important this is. Those red routes, every 15 minutes, you show up and you know a bus is going to be there for you. Old network, new network. Look at U of H right here. Suddenly you have red routes running to you from all over the place. This is a huge increase. And notice that these routes aren't all going downtown. They're crossing each other. They're meeting in all sorts of places. So if you look at the network now, we have what we call red routes, blue routes, and green routes. Red routes are every 15 minutes or better, 14 hours a day. Blue routes every 30 minutes or better, green routes every 60. Secondly, we make the network make more sense. This is Shepherd under the old network. This is Shepherd under the new network. There's a bus. It's called the Shepherd bus. It runs the full length of Shepherd. If you understand Houston, you can understand the network. And we set up a grid, and what's great about a grid is a grid doesn't guess at where you're trying to go. It says we are going to give you a good connection to get between any two places. So if you want to pick any point A or B, there's a reasonably direct way to get there. So that we went from something that was totally radial in terms of our frequent network to that grid. And if you look at all of these crossing points, I'm going to go from here to here. There's a crossing point right there to do it for me. And this bus I showed you right here, I rode the 25 over here today. We now have a single bus that runs on Richmond and runs on Wheeler. And guess what? A bunch of people are riding it. I got on this bus at the train. This connection never even existed before. There were 20 people with me on the bus, and we're running this every 15 minutes. That's a bunch of people who suddenly have a connection that never existed before. And this means real time savings. Example trip going from the Heights to Memorial City. In the old trip, you had to go east in order to go west. Now you can go west to go west. Travel time savings one way, about 40 minutes. Multiply that by 2, multiply that by 5, and think of what that means for somebody's life. Number 3, a 7-day system. Old network again. This is weekday, this is Saturday, this is Sunday, this is new network 7 days a week. We are the only major bus transit network in the United States that runs all of our routes as frequently on a Sunday morning as we do midday on a Monday. And it's huge transformative change if you're traveling on the weekend. You now have that same freedom on the weekend that you do on a weekday. And what that meant is we went from 25% of our riders having 7-day frequent service at their stop to 75%. Half of our riders got a massive upgrade in terms of the amount of frequency they got. And all of this was a very little compromise. 93% of boardings at the same exact stop as there were right now. So we didn't do this by taking service away from a bunch of people. We did it by making the service smarter. Doubled the number of people who live within walking distance of frequent service, increased the number of jobs within walking distance of frequent service by 50%. So what does this mean? Here, for example, is U of H. These are all of the bus routes and rail lines that run from U of H. Notice how well connected you are. You can get all the way out here to State Highway 6, all the way up here to Northeast Houston, down to Hobby Airport, all with just one bus or train from here. And then if you make one transfer, this is everywhere you can go. It's a remarkably well-connected network. And there's all sorts of connections that weren't possible before. For example, we built a new rail line in Harrisburg, so the number 50 bus that always went to Hobby Airport, we didn't need to send it downtown anymore because we had a rail line to do that. So what did we do instead? We didn't stop it at Magnolia where it meets the rail line. We had to keep going to Eastwood Transit Center, right next to the U of H campus. So now you can get on a U of H shuttle right into Eastwood and get on a bus that goes to Hobby Airport. That connection wasn't possible before. And we created it by being able to think more creatively about this network. What was so fun about this project is in transit, we have this tendency to think in really long time frames. Like when you're in the transit world, 2035 sounds really close. Like we're always doing 20-year plans, but this was not a long-range plan. All of those route changes I showed you, that all happened overnight last August. We went from an old bus network on Saturday night to a new bus network on Sunday morning. That's 10,000 stops worth, where all the signage was changed out. Here you can see a guy actually doing that change out. And suddenly we had a new network on the street. And we just celebrated the 1-year anniversary of that. What did it mean? Number one, on-time performance. We designed routes that actually run more reliably. Turns out straighter routes are more reliable. We designed routes that don't cross rail lines as often, which makes them more reliable. So, higher reliability. Secondly, we actually got fewer calls to our customer service center. Within 2 weeks of the new network, we had fewer people calling us then. And you'd think if you change everybody's bus route, you change literally every bus route in the system, you'd think you'd have a bunch more people calling customer service. No, we made it easier to understand. We made it easier to use. We introduced next bus texting. And suddenly it became a whole lot easier. And here's ridership. We were steadily losing ridership every month before. Here's August, and suddenly we've been gaining. And in fact, if you compare us to the rest of the country, we had the biggest ridership change year over year in terms of light rail. All those new connections to the light rail lines, we had basically a 30% increase in light rail boardings, more than any other city. And at the same time, we also added bus boardings. At a time when 2/3 of the transit systems in the United States were losing ridership. At a time when the economy was actually going down and gas prices were low, and just about everything else was working against us. So it's working. And the other thing that makes me really happy is we did actually put the best service where the people need it the most. I showed you that graph earlier about who has access to frequent service. This is our ridership now. Nearly 3/4 of our ridership is on those routes that run every 15 minutes or better. So we put the most frequent service where the most people need it. So what does this mean for you? Number one, whenever you're thinking about transit, think first about the frequent network. Those are the most reliable routes. Those are those routes where you don't need to look at a schedule. And we have this great new frequent network map that's part of our system map. It's a diagram. It's more like a rail map than a bus map, but it can really help you think through where you're going. Once again, U of H right here. But of course, you have that entire system for you. So look at the blue routes too, and look at the green routes too. Our system map is, I think, one of the great improvements we made here. We actually made a map that you can read, which is not true for the old map. Like, there's the old map, there's the new one. Which one's easier? And once again, you look at the geographically correct map, you can see the color coding for the frequency. You can tell right away that the 33 runs more often than the 49, and that that one runs more often than the 7. And downtown, I don't think anybody was ever actually able to use this map to figure out anything. And we now have a map you can actually understand. Step number 2, pay for your trip. Here's your Q card, and guess what? U of A students get discounted fare cards. So you can save money when you get on board. We have 2 choices. One's a day pass, and a day pass basically caps how much money you spend every day. That after 2.5 rides, all further rides are free. Really nice deal. So if you don't ride, you don't pay, but if you ride a lot, you're capped on what you spend. Secondly, we have the Q card, and that gives you loyalty bonuses for how often you ride. If you ride twice a day and no more, the Q card's good. If you ride more than twice a day, the day pass is better. You go on, you just tap it on this box. Here's the nice bus driver welcoming you right here. And I'll also note that if you don't have a Q card yet, we now have mobile fare payment. You can download an app on your smartphone, put in your credit card information, and you just show your phone to the driver and you're on board. Step number 3, Google Maps is the best trip planner you will ever find. Use it on your phone, use it on your computer, and it will plan that trip for you. And it will give you really good choices. Step number 4, when's your bus actually coming? It turns out we have an app that will tell you when the bus is actually coming. Not when it's scheduled to come, but when it's actually coming based on GPS information on the bus that's radioing back to headquarters, that's feeding to your phone. This is awesome. And guess what? If you don't have the app, you can do the same thing by text. Look at any Metro bus stop. Here's the number. You look at the bus stop number, you text it to this number, it will tell you when the bus is actually coming. This has made riding so much more pleasant. And step number 5, get on board and ride. You go to the bus stop, you will see the destinations. One of those minor wins. We're not telling you not just the number of the bus and the name of the bus, but which direction it's going. It sounds obvious, but this has made our system much easier to use. You look on the front of the bus to make sure it's the right number in the right direction. And once you're on board, this display will tell you what the next stop is. So just watch the display, and you'll know when to get off. When you're ready to get off, just pull the cord, the bus will stop for you. And I will also tell you, our bus drivers are really nice people. So if you're ever riding the bus and don't know what to do, just ask and they will help. They're awesome. And with that, I hope you guys all, if you haven't, check out our new system. And obviously check out the shiny new light rail line you have at your front door right here that I'm going to take home today. And think about all of that as one system. You really have access to a lot of Houston, to a lot of the things you need to do every day from this system that serves this campus. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Just curious if you've checked sort of certain areas, like let's say UH, how much ridership is increased or decreased?
We have not, the staff is actually working on doing more detailed analyses. I mean, I have a lot of anecdotal information, like places that seem to be working really well. I mean, like one of my friends was riding the bus on Montrose, where we went from running a bus every hour to running a bus every 15 minutes, and noticed at one stop the number of people getting on a single bus were more than the average number of people who got on a day under the old network. So we have some moments that we know are working, but there's still a lot of analysis to do. One of the things about this is, the first thing we did was try to deal with our current riders. So the first month and more was really trying to adjust to what was happening and making sure our current riders were served. And only then have we had a chance to sort of step back. I mean, we got complaints, and some of the complaints were great complaints. Like one of the leading sources of complaints we got is, the buses are too crowded. And I'm really happy to get that complaint. And we put a lot more service on a lot of routes to deal with that. We're only now really starting to promote this new network. And so I think a lot of the performance we're really only going to see once we've really been promoting it and once people make life decisions. Because here's the key on transit, and this is really important to think about. Generally, we talk about transit as if we're shifting people from cars to transit, and that's rarely what actually happens. What happens is somebody has a life change. They graduate from college and get a new job, and they decide, where am I going to live? And am I going to drive, or am I going to take the bus? Those kind of life changes are where we gain riders. So it doesn't happen suddenly. It happens, when your apartment lease is up. Do you look for a new apartment that's on a bus route that goes to campus? Suddenly we might gain a rider who before had to drive or hitch a ride with a friend. So we're going to see how this performs, not in the first year, but in the first couple of years. But I will say all the preliminary answers are very good. Well, I'll tell one of the things we're doing is actually targeted promotion here at U of H, where we're talking about things like which bus route will get you to the supermarket. Here's your Cougar Guide to Metro. It tells you all the routes that through campus, tells you how often they run, and tells you all the things you can get to on that. And we're doing, U of H is actually, you guys are actually our real first targeted marketing effort here. And part of the reason we picked that is, I mean, I'm a Rice alum, I love Rice, but I will say, first of all, you guys have a bunch more students. So, but secondly, U of H, if you look at the system, was actually one of the big winners. The amount by which the service increased here was more dramatic than just about anywhere else on the system. So what we have done to change people's ability to get there with transit, this is one of the spots where we've done the most. So that's one of the reasons we started promoting here. So pick up a brochure and learn about it. And I have to say, I have been impressed with U of H the whole way through, ever since I first got on the board, in terms of what this campus has actually done to make the campus community, students, faculty, staff, aware of what transit is here. U of H was doing some of the best targeted promotions I ever saw, way before we did the new network. So you guys are awesome.
Are there any plans ahead to expand rail system?
Well, this is a really fun question. Okay, so you've now entered the realm of politics.
Yes.
The decision on whether we expand rail or not is not made in the Metro boardroom. Well, I mean, I guess technically it's going to be made in the Metro boardroom, but that's not really how the world works. It's going to be made at a political level. I will tell you, our agency is in really good financial shape. We could afford to issue bonds, and those bonds could be used to build another rail line. If we want to issue those bonds, though, we have to pass a referendum. We have to put it on the ballot, and the voters of the Metro service area have to vote for it. And that means that people like the mayor of Houston have to feel comfortable with putting that on the ballot. So there's a couple of really big decisions coming up. Number one, what's the next thing we build? As people come to me sometimes and they've drawn a fantasy subway map of Houston, it's got like lines everywhere, and I say, that's great, but that's really easy. What's hard is, say you can build only 10 more miles of rail, where do you put them? Say you can build 20 miles of BRT, where do you put it? The question of what will do the most good, that's going to be a lot of discussion. I mean, example, one of the discussions has been sending the Southeast line to Hobby Airport. That same money can be used to extend the Main Street line to Missouri City. There's people down in Missouri City saying, we want that line. Is there going to be anybody saying, I want the Southeast line to go to Hobby Airport? That's where the politics are. Who speaks up? So I will say we're just starting a long-range planning effort. And we're going to hear a lot from the public. And I think you guys should all think of yourselves as people who can have a voice in that. So I would ask you the question, where should we invest in higher quality bus service? Where should we invest in BRT, like dedicated lanes for buses to make them faster, more reliable? Where should we invest in rail? And I would also say, and one of the things I learned, like I said, I got on the board by writing a blog, which sounds kind of odd. But what I learned about politics along the way is very few people speak up. And the result of that, the people who actually do speak up are immensely powerful. We have literally created bus routes at Metro because like one person showed up to speak to the board. If a city council member gets 5 letters on a topic, that's a landslide. If you guys were all to write to the mayor and your city council members and you all said the same thing, like that would be a mass movement. Like seriously, just a letter, just a phone call. I'm not a protest march in the streets, not forming a path, just telling people this is something that's important to me. You are way more powerful than you think.
How does Metro or do you all coordinate with like
One of the coolest places to go in Houston, if you ever have a chance to go, you need to, is a place called TransStar, which is a pretty anonymous looking building off the old Katy Road near where I-10 meets 610. There's a control room in there. In that control room, you have TxDOT people who control all those changeable message lines on the freeways, who watch all the traffic cameras. You have police people who can respond to any incident anywhere. You have City of Houston people who can customize traffic signals. And you have Metro's bus and rail dispatchers, and they're all sitting in the same room. It looks like mission control. And we work very close, even incident response. Like somebody breaks down on the freeway, it's spotted on a camera, and we send a Metro pickup truck out there to help them. It's all coordinated in that room. And guess what? If a hurricane starts heading our way, that same building is where all of that coordination is done. It's an amazing thing. And so on a day-to-day level, we actually work very well together. But I'll say that it's also something we could work a lot better together, and there's some things we're really working on. Like one of our biggest complaints we got was sidewalks and bus stops. And guess what? Old school transit agency answer to that? We're not in control of the sidewalk. New answer to that is we are going to work with the city and the county, and we are going to make those sidewalks better. We are going to figure out how to get more bus stops. And some of that is coordinating. It turns out a bus stop is really expensive, except just the shelter and the concrete pad, because pouring that concrete, sending a crew out just to pour one concrete pad, like that whole crew had to get mobilized just for that piece of concrete. That isn't cheap. If we upgrade that shelter at the same time the city rebuilds the street, or at the same time a developer builds a new parking lot, a new apartment complex, that gets a whole lot cheaper. So if we can coordinate, we can get a lot more done with the same money. And that's one of the big changes at Metro, that if you go back, Metro staff in the room can reminisce about previous CEOs, but if you go back a couple of regimes, there was really this mentality of sort of Metro as sort of a fiefdom unto itself. And under Tom Lambert, our current CEO, there's really a mentality of let's work together and figure this stuff out together. And really good things are happening as a result of that. And I think there's a lot more to come.
As you look at your 20-year planning period, beyond population, politics, and budget, what other key inputs do you look at to inform your planning decisions?
Well, one of the things, one of the really interesting things is how much data we have now. That if you compare to when our current round of rail lines were planned, 2002-ish, the amount of data, we know every boarding on the bus. When you board the bus, there's a little sensor that picks you up, that's linked to a GPS, and we know where you got on. We have a lot more traffic data than we ever did before. And we're just starting to figure out how to use all of that. And so, to me, one of the really big deals is reliability. When I think about what matters on transit, how long it takes absolutely matters. But how reliable it is matters every bit as much. As I can plan for travel time, unreliability is hard to plan for. And guess what? Some of our highest ridership routes aren't that reliable right now. How do we fix that? There's some of that is bus lanes. There's some really congested areas where we just need a lane to get that bus. The Galleria area at Christmas time is a really hard place to send a bus through, and guess what? It's our highest ridership route goes right there. Of course it goes right there because high ridership routes go to busy places. That's where we need them. But we're talking about things like smarter ways of dispatching the buses, and we're talking to the city about things like, what if the bus is running late, it could radio the traffic signal. And the traffic signal could turn green for the bus to help it catch up. What if we have places where the bus can sort of queue jump around traffic and get past the jam? There's a lot of things we could do to really make this everyday experience better using technology we used to never have before. And there's things we can do that we haven't even thought of yet. And so one of the interesting things about technology is a lot of people keep thinking that transit's going to be obsolete. It's amazing. First of all, everybody always thinks they've invented the best new transit technology. It's like it's personal rapid transit, it's a monorail. None of it really matters. It's much more important whether your transit vehicle has its own lane than whether it has steel rails underneath or rubber wheels. What really matters for good transit is not actually technology. And then we also hear this thing people say Uber now exists, so we don't need transit. Self-driving cars exist, so we don't need transit. guess what? There's something transit is really good at that none of these other things are good at. And that's packing a lot of people in a little space. And cities need that. Human beings like to gather together, but when human beings gather together, we get crowded. And if you give me the street real estate of a bus, I can fit 80 people in that. And if you do some single occupant cars, there's like 6 people in the same space. And if those cars are self-driving, guess what? There's still 6 people. You haven't solved that problem. So transit is really good at moving large amounts of people in straight lines through dense areas. And transit will always be good at that. It may be a self-driving bus in the future, but it's not going to be a bunch of individual self-driving cars because it is geometrically impossible to replace that. But I will say we're at a really interesting point because 2 really cool things are happening. The first is there's all these new technologies coming along. I mean, next bus texting, that was not possible when I was in college. Like, we didn't have cell phones. So first of all, a lot of new technologies coming along, both to make the experience better, to help us plan better. But secondly, you guys are all about to graduate from college. And there's a generational change happening in the transit industry. We have a bunch of people who joined transit in like the 70s who are getting close to retirement. And we need to replace them. And guess what? We have a generation now that actually loves cities and loves transit in a way that like previous generations didn't. And one of the best things that will happen to this world is when you guys are in charge. As I think it will make transit hugely better. And I'm totally looking forward to that.
To what extent do you guys coordinate with metros in other cities in Texas and across the country to sort of share some of the lessons learned around this new model?
Oh, that's been really fun. Like Columbus, Ohio was hanging out with us as we implemented this because they knew they were planning to do this and they were getting the lessons learned. Baltimore, Maryland is redoing their system and they're going through public outreach and you look at their materials and they totally learned from us and that's awesome. One of the most fun things about this is when we talk urban planning in Houston, we're used to being really down on ourselves. We're used to being like the place everybody makes fun of. I went to New York City, transit ridership capital of the United States. And I was talking to New York City MTA bus planners and they said, I wish we could do what you did in Houston. New York City is envying an aspect of our transit network, and that is just plain awesome. And so yes, there's a lot of places looking at this. There's other smaller cities that have done something similar, but no system our size has done anything like this since the early 1980s. But now a bunch of them are talking about it. And it's a really interesting way to think about innovation, that this is really innovation. And it's not innovation in the sense of new technology or software. It's innovation in the sense of asking a different question than we asked before, thinking about something in a different way. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can do. And that question, what if we redesign from a blank sheet? Literally, that is the question we asked. It's in the RFQ we sent out to get consultants. That was what I was talking about when we were talking about whether to do this project or not. That was a really good question. And sometimes life is about asking the right questions.
Maybe more of a personal question as a metro writer. What do you think of the social consequences and benefits from a city that has a transition from single car transit?
That's a really good question. I mean, first of all, single occupant cars cost a lot of money. If you look at your budget to maintain a car, and driving it less doesn't help that much, because driving it less doesn't change your car note, it doesn't change your insurance. Cars are expensive. And cars are also financially really unpredictable. I bet a bunch of you have beat up old cars. And with a beat up old car, one day it just stops working. And that's $2,000 or something. Like, transit doesn't do that to you. Like, I don't ever board the bus and say, sorry, it's not $1.25 today, it's $500. Like, there's a financial reliability to transit. And we know there's people in Houston who are scrimping on groceries to be able to afford their car. Like transit gives you a sort of financial freedom and dependability, and that means it's economic opportunity. It lets people get jobs they couldn't get otherwise, lets people get education they couldn't get otherwise. It's a great economic leveler. Transit makes people's lives better in a very real way. Like, people are happier as a result of not being behind that wheel. They're more productive because they can actually, get some reading done on the bus. And that's totally real. Studies have shown that. And I think transit just builds really great cities. Like, transit allows a level of density that leads to people mixing in ways that they don't mix otherwise, and it makes cities a lot more fun. And if you think about, like, the most fun cities in the world, the places you really want to go on vacation, they've pretty much all got transit networks that support that, that enable that. Without that, wouldn't be possible. And that, to me, is why I love transit. I love transit because it makes great cities. So I think ultimately transit has very real economic impacts, but it also has very real quality of life impacts. It makes cities better places to live in. It makes people's lives better on an everyday basis. That is, if it's good transit. What I just said doesn't count for a bus route that runs once an hour, 5 days a week through a neighborhood that's full of cul-de-sacs with no sidewalks. I mean, obviously that transit, it may be necessary as a lifeline, but it's not enabling people's freedom. And to me, good transit is freedom. Good transit, you have the sense that you're actually better off without a car. When I was in college, I lived in London for a summer, and I got that feeling, which is so glorious, that I never had to worry about where to put my car. And then wherever I wanted to go, there was a train or a bus that was going to get me there. That's a really great way to live. And like I said earlier, I mean, I live that in Houston. I work at Morris, I teach at Rice, I'm at Metro. Every one of those is a block away from the light rail line. I just ride the train back and forth all day, and it's made my life so much better. And that's what transit is. Transit is about making people's lives better. And also saves the planet while it's doing it.
Does Metro have a view on how the electrification of the transportation sector will impact mass transit, as well as the timescale in which it'll reach commercial viability?
The electrification question is really interesting, because I would love it if every transportation vehicle out there was electric. I would love it if all our buses were electric. It's got a huge amount of benefits. I mean, one of the biggest of which is it's flexible for fuel source in a way other things aren't. Like, that same an electric bus doesn't care if it has wind power electricity or nuclear electricity or natural gas electricity. It's all the same thing. It's all electrons. And it's interesting is we've been electrifying transit for a long time. You go to San Francisco and you've got electric streetcars, you've got electric trolley buses, and they're all powered using hydroelectric power from the Sierra Nevada. And if you've ever been to San Francisco, you should try riding on the electric buses. It's just amazing. These are like so quiet. Like, it's just a little electric motor spinning under your feet. It's so much quieter than having a diesel engine next to you. So as battery technology gets better, I think we have a huge opportunity to move from, we've been moving from diesel to natural gas on buses. I hope the next evolution is electric. So far, the technology isn't there yet. That the recharging times it takes are problematic. Like, we schedule, say, 15 minutes for a bus to arrive at a transit center at the end of the route before it starts its next run. Sometimes that bus is 10 minutes late. It only has 5 minutes left. If that were an electric bus, that wouldn't be enough time to recharge, and that bus would be late for its next run. So right now, for electric buses, you have to sort of build padding in that we don't have otherwise. And one of the most unfortunate things in Houston is August is murder on electric buses. Because if you look at one of our buses in August, a huge proportion of its energy is actually going to the air conditioning. And that's a problem we have much more than other cities. But this is I find it entirely plausible that there's a future where in 20 years, a network that looks very much like this network is operated by driverless electric buses. And guess what? What that would do for us, I mean, first of all, like I said, make the ride better, etc. But we'd actually be able to run more service, because the cost of running that service would be dramatically reduced. So I think there's technologies out there which could really change transit in a fundamental way. And I do think the power end of things is one of those things. But I have a hard time predicting the future, and I will also say that as a transit agency, we are going to be naturally cautious because we're spending taxpayers' dollars. And if we pick the wrong technology and it turns out not to work, it's a huge mess. So there is an aspect of the transit sector that is naturally cautious for very good reasons. One more? Yes. Yeah, essentially, we have 1,200 buses. We're one of the biggest bus fleets in the United States. I think we're in the top 10. And generally, our local buses are designed to last about 12 years. Our park and ride buses last a little longer. So when we do a fleet transition, what we do is we don't throw out our buses. When it comes time to replace a bus, we replace it with a different kind of bus. So right now, our fleet is largely diesel and diesel hybrid, but we are now ramping up on natural gas. We've installed a fueling station, which incidentally is dual use. It's commercial fleets can use the same fueling station, but it's next to one of our bus operating facilities. And we are purchasing new natural gas buses. So those are like slowly filtering into the fleet. But we don't, a complete fleet replacement takes us 12 years. And one of the lessons Metro learned, and it had already been implemented before I got on the board, but a really smart decision was, there's some networks which sort of buy all of their buses at once, and then let them all age at the same time, and then have to buy a huge amount of buses at one time. We're actually now we're buying 100 buses a year, so that we naturally cycle through that replacement. Our goal is an average bus age of around 6 years, because that's much more sustainable than suddenly having to write this huge check at one time to replace the entire fleet. And there's other agencies that have made that mistake, and they're paying for it now. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your presentation. It was great. So now we invite everyone to network and introduce yourselves to each other. Think about where you're commuting from. Think about different alternative methods. Please visit our exhibitors here. We have Metro Star, Metro, and we also have Parking and Transportation promoting their COAST program. If you guys haven't heard of that, it stands for COOS on Alternative Sustainable Transportation. They offer many discounts for carpooling, using public transportation to campus. We also have some concept gallery posters posted around the room. And this is just to trigger your minds and discussions of different innovative ways of alternative transportation that are occurring both at a national and international level. And then any ideas you might have. You can grab the markers that are on your table and just start drawing or writing just any sort of creative ideas that you might have, keeping Houston in mind. And what are some innovations you'd like to see for alternative transportation here? And then lastly, these are just some upcoming events that we have. Starting on October 5th, all day at 10 different Whole Foods locations. The University of Houston will receive 5% of generated revenue, which will go back to our campus community garden. So we appreciate everyone shopping at Whole Foods that day. And then we have our largest event, which is the Sustainability Fest, and that will be located here on campus. And November 8th, we'll have a ton of vendors, prizes, things of that nature. So thank you all for coming and attending. And Christof, we have a little thank you gift for speaking with us today.
Honestly, I would very much like to improve bus service to Katy. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to build a rail line because we already invested all that money in those managed lanes where we can actually run buses very fast. So what I'd like to do is get better chops for those buses. Like I want a transit center at Gester and I-10 so that if you're, say, going from Katy to Memorial City, you could just get off right there and be at Memorial City.
that is.
And then it's gotta have like the little band with the stars.
Yeah, they have free Renaissance tickets last year. You get 30% off theater district in downtown, so it's worth registering.
So we just how do we prove that we didn't use the car? Because I don't have a car.
But actually, when you create your profile,
Yeah.
you're going to go to a calendar. After you created your profile, there's going to be a calendar, and then you add the mileage on that calendar. So you're saying, look, I did 5 miles today, and between campus and downtown, and I did it on alternate trains.
It's like you can manage it online, but you have to call them first.
How do you set that up?
It's brand new. It's called our mobile ticketing.
Okay.
And so you can actually now, that's what he was mentioning really quickly about how you can actually tap it. Now you actually just show it to him. You don't have to tap anymore. And it shows up on your phone and it shows your balance as well.
Okay.
So yeah, we're way ahead of you.
Nice.
This table is about parking permits, shuttles, the light rail, anything regarding transportation.
So is the shuttle like
For the UH shuttle?
yeah, the UH
Sure, it's completely free, just like a Google card, so we can have the metrics and kind of rearrange them as we need to. But totally free.
Okay, and how do you use this pen? Like,
This is the tire gauge. So you use it to check the PSI on your car.
that's so cute.
Right, but take one anyway, yeah. This should be about 60 PSI each one.